Good morning, Professor Eddleston.
Good morning.
Your evidence will be taken by Miss Thompson, counsel to the inquiry. We normally have a break at 11:30, but if you wish a break before that, please just let me know.
Thank you.
Would you now please say the words of the affirmation after me? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Thompson.
Good morning, Professor. What is your full name, please?
My name is Michael Philip Eddleston,
How old are you, Professor Eddleston?
54.
And you are a Professor of Clinical Toxicology at Edinburgh University.
That's correct.
Can I ask you to open up the blue folder that's in front of you? There are a number of documents there that you might find it helpful to refer to whilst you give your evidence, so we'll begin by just looking at what's in the folder.
Yep.
The first document in the folder should be a copy of your CV. That's witness 00006. It's an extensive CV. I think it extends to 30 pages or thereby. We don't need to go through it in any great detail. The chair to the inquiry and the assessors all have copies which they can read at their leisure. The next document should be a letter of instruction sent to you by the Crown Office and dated the 26th of April 2017. That's COPFS 02360. Do you have that?
I have that.
There should then be the report that you prepared in answer to the questions asked of you by the Crown Office.
Yes.
Your report is dated the 2nd of June 2017 and the reference is COPFS 00038.
Yes.
Finally, there should be a copy of a statement that you gave to the inquiry. We'll perhaps bring this one up on the screen. That's SBPI 00317. And if we scroll down a little, we'll see that the statement was taken on the 6th of January, amended at the end of March, and if we scroll to the very end of the document, we should see that it was signed on the 4th of May of this year. Sorry, just a little bit up from the references, I think. There we are, just a few lines down. There we go. 4th of May of 2023. Professor Eddleston, your signature has been blanked out on the version on the screen, but can you confirm, please, that you have signed or e-signed every page of the report that's in the folder in front of you? Returning to the screen at paragraph 142, you concluded your statement with the words, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website.
I agree.
As I've said, you can refer to any of these documents at any time if you would find it helpful to do so. And if there's anything that you would like me to have put up on the screen, please just let me know. I want to begin by asking you a little about your qualifications and experience, and if we can perhaps scroll to the top of this document and go to the second paragraph. You explain that you're a professor of clinical toxicology and a consultant clinical toxicologist and pharmacologist, and you give your qualifications, and there then follows a very long list of letters after your name. So I want to ask you a little bit about your qualifications. In paragraph 3, you explain that you began your university education with a bachelor's degree at Cambridge University. What subject did you read at Cambridge?
I read medical sciences.
Medical sciences. And so you were awarded the bachelor's degree and then subsequently the Masters of Arts. Would that also have been in medical sciences?
The master's is non-specific for a subject. It simply means that 4 years before you finished your undergraduate degree.
Right, I see.
It's simply a voting. By becoming a master's, you're allowed to vote in the Senate. So it's a 500-year-old tradition.
I see. So it wasn't a separate qualification as such.
I did no work at all.
No work at all.
Probably just paid money.
It's simply a token from the university 4
gift.
years after you graduate.
Exactly.
A parting gift. In paragraph 4, you explain that in 1994 you received a PhD in neuropathology. That degree was from the University of Cambridge, but your research was in California. And you completed that in 3 years as opposed to the usual 7 for an American PhD. Again, just scrolling down a little to paragraph 5, you explain that you then began your medical degree in 1994 at Oxford on this occasion. And during your time at Oxford, you spent a year in Sri Lanka seeing poisoned patients. Now, elsewhere in your statement, you explain that a poisoned patient is someone who has been exposed to a poison. So it might be convenient at this juncture to ask you to explain to us what is a poison.
So poison is a huge variety of different compounds which cause harm to the body. And generally, a poison is something that's ingested. So in contrast to venom. So a snake venom, a snake is not poisonous, it's venomous. So things like a scorpion or a snake, they inject the poison and therefore becomes a venom into the body. Poisons are generally exposed by ingestion, but they can be through the skin and they can be by breathing.
So poisons would include then things like medicines
Sure.
and recreational drugs.
Yes, it's often about the dose.
We'll talk more about the dose perhaps later this morning. Returning to Sri Lanka, how did that year in Sri Lanka come about?
I was writing a textbook and I had no money. And so I took a year off medical school to write the textbook. And it was cheaper for me to go and run clinical trials in Sri Lanka. And I paid $7 every 2 weeks for food and $50 a month for accommodation. It became very slim. And saw patients, wrote lots of papers and wrote the book. But it gave me the chance every day to see all the patients coming to the hospital who'd be described as poisoned patients.
What types of poisoning did you see in Sri Lanka?
So the most common ones there were plant poisoning and pesticide poisoning. As in the UK, people would take a medicine at moments of stress or crisis. In Sri Lanka, they don't have medicine cabinets. There's no medicines in the houses, but they have pesticides. 85% of the communities around this hospital were using pesticides on a daily basis. So at moments of crisis, when they grab something to communicate, and mostly self-harm and self-poisoning is about communication. I'm angry, I'm distressed, you're not listening to me. It's a very dramatic way of getting a message across. And in Sri Lanka, it was pesticides and plants with some small amounts of medicine. So related to what I do here, but not quite the same.
So your interest in poisoning then was well established even before you'd completed your medical degree.
Yes.
You graduated in 1998, and if we can perhaps scroll down to paragraph 15, you explain that following your graduation, you started work as a junior doctor and then secured a fellowship to return to Sri Lanka, where you spent 4 years seeing poisoned patients on a daily basis.
Yes.
What was your role when you were in Sri Lanka? What post did you hold?
So I was a research registrar, which would mean I'm superfluous. I'm extranumerary within the hospital. I had medical licensing in Sri Lanka to practice and therefore see patients independently, but always under the supervision of a consultant, of a Sri Lankan consultant. Because there were relatively few doctors on the ward and there were many poisoned patients and I had skills and I was recognized to be a competent doctor, I really saw the patients by myself independently from the consultants and discussed cases. But it would mean, effectively I was a supernumerary doctor, but with a license to practice in Sri Lanka, which would be unusual for a non-Sri Lankan.
And again, were the poisons that you saw, or the cases of poisoning that you saw, largely plant and pesticide based?
So, pesticide number 1, plant number 2, and medicines number 3. Recreational drugs were very rare.
Moving on to paragraph 16, you explain that you returned to Edinburgh in 2005 and completed your higher training in clinical pharmacology and toxicology with a specialty in clinical toxicology. So I wanted to ask you a few questions around that. Can you help us to understand what is meant by higher training for a doctor?
So, when we start out for the first 2 years, we're trying to become vaguely competent with a more general knowledge, looking at surgery or pediatrics or medicine or psychiatry. You're simply trying to get experience. There's a big step up from being a student to suddenly having responsibility. And so those first 2 years, roughly, are spent just trying to get as much experience as you can. And then the next 2 years are spent trying to work out, do I want to become a pediatrician or do I want to become a surgeon? You might start moving towards jobs which give you experience in those. And then after about 4 years, you would apply for a position for a training number, that's how it used to be called, of 5 years of training to become a surgeon or to become a clinical pharmacologist in my case, or a general physician. At the end of, it might take you 8 years, depending on how many different subjects you want to put together. It can take somewhere between 5 and 8 years. At the end of that, you become a consultant, at which point you're considered independent and competent.
And you mention clinical pharmacology and toxicology. Can you explain what those are and what the difference between them is?
So they're a specialty of medicine. So they're one, if we think of pediatrics, medicine, obsgyne, and surgery as the main areas, this is one of the specialties within medicine. So I would have done my first 4 years trying to do as much medicine as possible, and then I've taken a choice to do clinical pharmacology. So clinical pharmacology is normally combined with general medicine, so the whole of general medicine, leave it at that for now. And pharmacology is about understanding how medicines work in our body. So how they get into the patient, how they spread around the patient, and how they work in the patient. So clinical pharmacology is generally about a therapeutic dose of a medicine and how a person might use those medicines if they take them every single day. Clinical toxicology is a further subspecialty within clinical pharmacology when we're talking about overdoses. And those overdoses can be a moment of crisis when someone takes an overdose for a medicine, or perhaps the medicine has a bad reaction in patients. We have adverse drug reactions to the medicines, which some people have a problem with certain medicines. We study those as well. And we study things like recreational drugs, and in my case, plant and pesticide poisoning.
When did you complete your higher training?
I got my first consultant job in 2008 in Newcastle, where I went as a locum consultant. So in your last 6 years of higher training, you can start looking to see if there are jobs available. And there was an opening in Newcastle where I went and worked part-time as a locum consultant, which is kind of that transition between the end of your higher training and becoming a full-time consultant.
And am I right in thinking that in 2009 you then secured a full-time permanent consultancy in Edinburgh?
So that was with a senior clinical fellowship. So as an academic, I'm employed by the university. And my interest is doing as much research as I possibly can to try and address questions I see in the patients in front of me. So I applied for Scottish Senior Fellowship, was awarded that, which gave me salary for 4 years. By getting that, the university took me on, and then the NHS Lothian took me on as an honorary consultant. So I don't get paid anything by the NHS, and I give 1 day a week of my university time to the NHS to do my work. So that's when I got my, effectively my 10-year job, but it wasn't in the NHS, it was in the university.
Yes, you explain further into your CV, into your statement, if we can perhaps look at paragraph 17, that you have a number of jobs, you say about 5 jobs, and you work a lot of hours, that your main role is as a professor of clinical toxicology at the University of Edinburgh, and that's been a post that you've held since 2013, and you say you're one of 3 professors of clinical toxicology in the UK. Should we understand there are only 3 professors of clinical toxicology in the UK?
Yes.
So you explain, and you told us a little about this already at paragraph 18, that 1 day a week you work as an honorary consultant clinical toxicologist and pharmacologist at Edinburgh Royal University. You donate your time, you're not paid for your time, to the role to assist with your work at the university. Your research is tied in with the patients you see here in the UK and in Asia, and you perform ward rounds and treat poisoned patients. Can you help me to understand the difference then between your role as a professor at the university, which I presume is a more academic role, and your role as an honorary consultant, which I think must be a more clinical role? Can you tell us a little bit more about these 2 roles that you hold?
So the simplest role is to describe the honorary consultant role, where 1 day a week I go into the hospital and I see the patients there. So I have an honorary contract with NHS Lothian. I have the same rights, I'm perceived to be the same level as my colleagues who are NHS consultants, and I fit into a rota of 5 or 6 consultants now, and we share out the workload. I would see the patients in various parts of the hospital. I'd try and support their care and support their discharge, really. That would be my routine work. The rest of the week, I do another day, which I probably, 19, if I put number 19 in now, if that was possible.
Absolutely. Let's bring up number 19 for you.
It kind of works better, well. So I see patients physically myself, I actually examine a patient and I make decisions with them. At the same time, I support the rest of the UK to care for these patients in hospitals where there is no clinical toxicologist. There's 16 of us in the UK. There's only 6 hospitals which have a clinical toxicology consultant in the hospital. So they will be seeing patients like I do 1 day a week, and the rest of the time, 1 day a week each roughly, we then support other hospitals across the UK to try and help their doctors care for patients. So those are the 2 jobs, one of which is virtual, effectively on the telephone, and one is real, but they're very much the same job. And then the rest of the time, I'm a university professor, and that I'll be asked to teach, I'll be asked to sit on committees to decide whether we should do various trials in the hospital. But predominantly what I do is I write grants and I write papers and I run research. So every 5 years I get assessed, and that's assessment on how many grants have I brought into the university, how many papers have I written, and what impact has my work had globally. So that's what I'm judged on through the university.
Thank you. You've given me a lot of information, so I'm going to ask you a few more questions, if you don't mind. Can we go back to paragraph 18, please? So at 17 and 18, you explain your position as a professor and your position as a consultant, and you say at paragraph 18 that you donate your time to your role at the hospital to assist with your work at the university. How is it that your position at the hospital supports the work that you do at the university? How do those 2 interests come together?
That's a decision made by the university that the medical academics in the university should be contributing to the work of the local hospital. Clearly, we have skills and resource, we have skills and time, and we can contribute to the NHS care. So that is simply the university saying it's good for us to provide services to our local community. At the same time, my individual research is very much based on the patients I see in front of me. So the questions I have and the grants I write are based on either patients I see in Asia or patients I see in Scotland.
And what are your current research interests?
So I have a study in Bangladesh. We're trying to recruit 3,300 patients. We've recruited 940 at the moment to a study of how can I stop people dying after organophosphorus insecticide, self-poisoning. So this is a type of pesticide, and I'm trying to work on one little mechanism in that poisoning picture, and I'm trying to stop people dying by giving them a medicine. And that's a trial which is going on with my Bangladeshi colleagues. So quite a lot of my life is spent working on that. I have a study in Sri Lanka at the moment, trying to find out, people go to pesticide shops to buy a pesticide to then drink it as a way of communicating. Some people die, and that's clearly not good news for the pesticide seller. So we're doing a trial of randomizing 1,400 pesticide sellers across a region of Sri Lanka with 2.5 million people, trying to find out, can we help the pesticide vendors not sell to people who are going to drink it, because it's good for their business and it's good for the community. And so that's a big public health study that's going on. Do you really want to know all this stuff I do? Because I think it could go on for quite a long time.
I think I did say this morning that we hope to complete your evidence in the course of today. So I think those 2 examples give us a flavour of your current research interest. Is there another one?
I'll give you one more, which is a flavour.
One more.
We could go on for quite a long time otherwise. So what we've just got money for is to do a study of flumazenil. So we have many drug deaths in Scotland of people who are taking opioids and benzodiazepines. This huge increase we've seen in Scotland in the last 10 years is associated with that combination. We have a lovely antidote, if you can use the right word, of naloxone for opioids, which works very well. But people are still dying. So the question is, should we be using an antidote for benzodiazepines? One exists. It's called flumazenil. We don't use it because we worry about seizures. So we're trying to do a study going back to the beginning and saying, can we use flumazenil safely? And potentially in 5 or 10 years' time, we'll have a second antidote which may stop all these deaths. So my research is also based on Scottish work.
So your research is wide-ranging and involves your patients both in the UK and far, far further afield in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh.
Nigeria
and Nigeria too, and other countries.
Yep.
We have your CV, as I've mentioned. It's a very lengthy CV, and it's there for us to read at our leisure and learn more about your research. Returning then to paragraph 18, because I have another couple of questions for you about this paragraph. You say when you work at Edinburgh University on a voluntary basis or on the basis that you're not remunerated for, 1 day a week you perform ward rounds and treat poisoned patients. What wards are you working on at the university?
In the hospital.
Sorry, I beg your pardon.
So in the hospital there's an acute medicine unit which has 6 bays. There is something called Base 6, which is quite famous, we might argue, because this is the toxicology ward. So all the drug overdose patients or the recreational drug patients gets through there, and we look after them in that ward. So it's called Base 6 of the acute medical unit in the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh.
You say you treat poisoned patients. You've told us about the type of poisoning that you typically see in Sri Lanka. What types of poisoning are you called upon to treat in your work at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary?
So the one most common would be overdoses of medicines. For example, paracetamol is a particular problem we have here. Antidepressants, things like fluoxetine, sertraline, sometimes some heart drugs like calcium channel blockers. There's a huge number of various medicines, and whatever people have available is generally what they take. Sometimes people plan in advance, who have a higher intent, it's a more lethal attempt, will go out and look for various medicines and get them from people or buy them. But most people just grab what's available in the house, so it depends what medicines they're taking. That's the most common form of poison I would see. The second most common is recreational drugs, or I'm not sure recreational is the right word, but non-medicinal drugs, for example, cocaine, heroin, and then sometimes the medical treatments we use to support people who are addicted to drugs, like methadone, would be the classical one.
Let's look again at paragraph 19. You took us to it already, and you explained a little about the National Poisons Information Service. You explained that you and the other clinical consultant toxicologists across the UK, I think that you said there were 16 of you, so 16 consultants and 3 professors in the UK. Those of you at the consultant grade, between you, provide an on-call service for the National Poisons Information Service.
Yeah.
So let me ask you some questions about that. What is the National Poisons Information Service?
So in the 1950s, there was a realization there was a growing problem in the UK and across the world of people taking overdoses of medicines. And so there was a realization there was a need for a specialty to grow up and a place to treat these patients. So Edinburgh had already had a consultant called Henry Matthews, who had already realized this was a problem and started writing about it. And so about 4 or 5 centres across the UK were set up as poison centres. And they basically worked as independent centres for many years. And around 2003, the Health Protection Agency, which was the old Public Health England organisation, decided to bring everyone together into one organisation. So we became the National Poisons Information Service with the Edinburgh unit or the Newcastle unit or the London unit, for example. These were all the units that were put together. And we now have a single telephone call. So when when a healthcare worker calls that number, they will get through to one of the 4 centres, and we have people who take phone calls, and then if there's a particularly problematic patient, they'll then call a consultant for further advice.
So when you were on call, are you on call 24/7, 365 days a year, or is it on a rota basis with the other consultants?
So the service is on call, I'm on, almost uniquely, I'm on call 365, 24/7 because of snake bites. So I have a special interest in snake bites. So if someone's pet cobra bites them in Birmingham, they call through to the service. The UK has a set of antivenoms for lots of different exotic snakes, which people like to keep as pets, apparently. And then I take a phone call at 3 in the morning saying what antivenom should be using for this one. And there's myself and a colleague in Liverpool. We take the calls. We're on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, etc. for these particular cases. And there's probably 10 a year. Otherwise, we share up the rota in a more civilized fashion.
You say at the bottom of paragraph 19 that alongside taking calls, you edit TalkSpace. Tell us about TalkSpace.
So classically in the past, before the mid-1990s, everybody did phone calls. So it was all relayed on phone calls, and which takes time, and it's not a very efficient way of getting information, and actually limited the number of patients we could advise on. Around the 80s and into the 90s, a database was set up, which around 98 to 2000 went online. So now the situation is, when a patient comes to hospital in the UK, say there's 300,000 poison patients a year, practically every case, the doctor who looks after the patient will go online and look up information about how to manage that particular poison by going onto a database. That database is edited by the National Poisons Information Service and led from Edinburgh. And this gives you the basics. So this allows you to care for 95% of patients. And then there's a few patients who are more complicated, they get telephone calls. So now we have something like 1.6 million accesses to TalkSpace, and only 50,000 phone calls. While in the past we'd have had 300,000 or 400,000 phone calls. And then of that 50,000 phone calls, we get maybe 5 go to consultant, 5,000 go to consultants. So this allows us much more efficiently to provide information across pretty much any poison people will see coming into the emergency department.
Thank you. If we could perhaps now move on to paragraph 20, in which you explain that you are the chair of the Clinical Standards Group, which means that you direct the poison centres across the whole of the UK. What do you mean by you direct the poison centres across the whole of the UK?
So these were independent units and they have their own directors. So between 2012 and 2016, I was the director of the Edinburgh unit of the National Poisons Information Service. I then demitted from that and a colleague of mine took over. We have a chair who brings together the 4 units and is the face of the 4 units to the rest of the world and the rest of the UK. So currently I'm in that position since April last year, when my colleague, Professor Simon Thomas, retired.
You also say, I'm now the senior clinical toxicologist in the UK. Should we understand that to mean that you are the most senior clinical toxicologist in the UK?
Yes. As a result of that position, and being one of the few professors of clinical toxicology.
Thank you. If we could perhaps return briefly to the series of letters after your name, if I can ask for us to have paragraph 8 on the screen. Here you explain that you have a fellowship of the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh. You say that you secured that position a year after becoming a consultant. That would have been in around 2010?
Yes. Yes.
At paragraph 9, you explain that you also have a fellowship of the British Pharmacological Society, and that the fellowship recognises that you're a clinical pharmacologist and that you do good quality work in clinical pharmacology, and you received that in 2014 and have been awarded prizes from the Society. And at paragraph 10, you explain that you have a fellowship of the European Association of Poison Centres and Clinical Toxicologists, which is the specialist European organisation that you belong to, and it brings together all the poison centres and clinical toxicologists on an annual basis to a congress. And you tell us that you were one of the first to be awarded the inaugural fellowship, and you were probably one of the youngest. If we could, jump back up to paragraph 6. You explain that you also have a Doctor of Science. You explain that you wrote 75 papers about poisoned patients, published in major journals, put together in a thesis and submitted to Cambridge University. And that's a qualification you received in 2014, and it recognises that you're a specialist in your area and that your research is of high quality. 75 papers about poisoned patients. Were they based on the patients that you see in the UK or Asia? Asia.
So I have about 40 patients, 340 papers now. This was a block of 75 papers around a particular area, which was about, I think practically all were about Sri Lanka.
And do you continue to travel to Sri Lanka and other overseas countries?
Not very much. I was in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka in November last year, and I was in Nepal briefly in April. So I probably travel 4 or 5 times a year. Having lived there for a long time, I have the connections which allow me to be more peripheral now.
Thank you. I want to ask you a few questions about your previous experience of giving evidence. Have you been asked to give evidence before?
About 3 or 4 times.
And have you advised on cases over the years in anticipation of giving evidence, and perhaps that hasn't been required?
I've probably written maybe, I'm not many. I'm a full-time academic, so I don't do many reports, but maybe 50 or 60 over the last. This is one of my first ones in 2017. I think I've been doing it since about 2014, 2015. 2 or 3 a year originally, 1 or 2 a year, and now more like 10 a year.
So these are medical legal reports?
Yes.
Okay. And are they in civil cases or criminal cases?
So the times I've been to court have been PFs twice. here and once in a coroner one in Manchester. I've never been to court yet for a civil one
Okay.
or a criminal.
And who do you tend to be instructed by? Which side of the
Both
case?
sides.
Both sides. And have you ever before been involved in a case involving a death in custody?
Yes. So it depends what you mean by custody precisely. So one was a very similar situation, someone who died near Aberdeen, who was restrained by the police and had been exposed to cocaine. And a second one, again a similar one, I can't remember where it was now, who had been tried to be arrested by the police, took cocaine, and then was transported to the police station, and in the police station he died from cocaine toxicity.
Through your medical legal work, do you have an understanding of the importance of being independent
Yes,
and of being objective and unbiased in your views?
as far as I can be, yes.
And do you understand that your role here today is to assist the chair to the inquiry in matters within your expertise as a clinical toxicologist?
I do understand that.
Can I ask you now to look at the letter of instruction from Crown Office, and we'll bring that up on the screen. It's COPFS 02360. So it's dated the 26th of April of 2017. And if we could scroll down, please. So there's a little background about the case, and if we keep scrolling down, please. If we stop there, do we see that some background information having been provided, the Crown say, given your experience, they wish to instruct you to provide a general opinion on the individual and any synergistic effects of MDMA and alpha-PVP on the brain. In particular, the Crown are seeking to establish what effect the levels and combination of these two drugs may have had on the deceased, and that of course is Sheco Bio's mood, cognitive ability and behaviour. So that was that one paragraph there contains the question that was posed by the Crown. Were you asked at all in that letter or subsequently by the Crown Office to consider the effects of these drugs on the heart?
No, I don't believe I was. I believe the PF who wrote me the letter passed away sometime after that. And that may be the wrong thing, but I think there was a change of staff. We went quiet for a long time, and maybe that's wrong, but I think that's what I remember.
All right. Let's scroll down to the bottom, where I think there should be a list of the documents that were made available to you. So there's quite a long list, but if we can read it short, we see that there are some statements from witnesses, that's civilians, and from police officers, medical notes, a briefing paper, post-mortem report, toxicology report, neuropathology, medical notes again, a use of force, standard operating procedure, and a number of expert reports prepared by others in connection with the case. So those various documents were sent to you under cover of the letter of instruction, and in response you prepared your report, and we'll perhaps bring your report up now. It's COPFS 00038. Now I want to skip through this quite quickly at this point. We see that your report is dated the 2nd of June. I want to just familiarise ourselves with the structure to your report. So if we could just scroll through it fairly slowly, please. There's a preamble in which, at the first paragraph, you say that you're aware of the role of an expert witness and of your need to deal with matters within your expertise and provide a fair and accurate opinion with respect to the case. There's a little bit of information there about your background and your qualifications. If we could scroll down, please. The second chapter of your report is the instructions. And again, you repeat the list of documentation that was provided to you. The third chapter is the query, and you have copied over the question that we looked at a moment ago from the Crown's letter of instruction. There's then a section headed Background, which appears to be a summary of the information that seemed to you to be pertinent, gleaned from the documents that were sent to you.
Yes.
And if we move beyond background, There's a summary of the toxicology results that were contained within your papers. You then record a psychiatric diagnosis provided by Dr. Lipsage retrospectively. You offer a view on that. There's then a section on the effects of 2 drugs that we know were in Mr. Bayou's system, alpha-PVB and MDMA. And if we can scroll through that for now. There's the role of these drugs in causing his drug-induced psychosis, and then an addendum. And at this point, I would like to ask you some questions about the addendum. We'll look at the other parts of your report shortly. So paragraph 16, under the heading Addendum, Police Scotland Use of Force Standing Operating Procedure, you say, I would like to make an additional comment on the Police Scotland Use of Force SOP, which may be relevant to this case. I was provided with this document as background reading for my opinion. Now, the addendum is fairly lengthy, and I don't think there's any need for us to look at it in detail. But do you go on to note that the standard operating procedure provides useful advice on how to deal with patients suffering from mental health disorders, including psychosis, and that advice is consistent with standard clinical practice for the management of psychotic patients?
Yes.
And that's at paragraph 17. If we scroll down to paragraph 18, again reading it short, do you note that drug-induced psychosis is dealt with separately in the SOP, and that the guidance offered to police officers dealing with patients with mental health issues is not repeated in the context of dealing with patients with drug-induced psychosis? And you make the observation that this is unfortunate since the principles are the same.
Yes.
In the paragraphs that follow, you set out how patients with acute psychosis are managed in emergency departments. You offer a view as to how Sheco Bayo might have been handled differently by the police. And you conclude in paragraph 24 by recommending a discussion between police and emergency medicine physicians to increase understanding of how to manage these patients and to refine the current guidance.
Yes.
Would that be a fair summary of the addendum to your report?
Yes.
Now, the SOP, the standard standing operating procedure, you were sent that by the Crown.
Yes.
Was there any explanation given to you as to why they were sending it to you?
No, it was provided as background reading for me to make a decision.
Were you specifically asked to comment on it?
No.
Were you given any instruction at all as to what you were supposed to do with it?
No.
And what did you take from the fact that it had been sent to you at all?
I think this was information about the situation and the procedures the police followed at the time of Mr. Bayou's death.
And what was your reason for offering a comment or a commentary on what is said in the standard operating procedure?
My clinical practice in Edinburgh involves admitting many patients, tens or hundreds over the years, of patients with psychosis where it's absolutely unclear whether this is due to primary mental illness or due to drugs or to a combination. And so these patients are kept in our ward until it becomes clear whether it's drug-induced, in which case it should fade away over a day or two, or whether it's mental health, where it may not fade away, and they may need admitting to a psychiatric hospital. They spend time on our wards as we try to understand what's going on. It's actually not possible, at least in the early stages, to differentiate at all. So the idea that there should be 2 ways of treating patients, one with a mental health primary cause and one with a drug-induced primary cause, doesn't fit with clinical practice.
I see. And in your statement, if we could perhaps return to that, at paragraph 33, in paragraph 33, you explain that this was not an expert opinion and your view was based on your day-to-day clinical experience on your ward, which is what you've explained to us in your evidence today. Professor, just for the avoidance of doubt, were you seeking to offer a view as an expert on the use of force?
I'm not an expert on use of force. I'm a clinician who has to at times use force to safely care for a patient.
And the comments that you make in your addendum, you have told us, were based on your clinical experience as a practicing clinician and toxicologist who
Yes.
does ward rounds.
Yeah.
I'd like to move on to ask you some questions about the drugs that we know were found in Shekobio's system. Firstly, alpha PVP, and if we could perhaps move to paragraph 63 of your statement. Much of your report has been copied into your statement, Professor, so to avoid us jumping between documents, I'll work largely from your statement going forwards. So you referred to a paragraph in your report where you state that alpha PVP is a relatively new synthetic cathinone stimulant drug with similar effects to other stimulant drugs such as cocaine, amphetamine, and methamphetamine. And in the paragraphs that follow, you explain the terminology. But perhaps in your evidence this morning, I could ask you just to say a little bit more about alpha PVP and what is meant by a synthetic cathinone stimulant drug.
So crudely, the way I think about it, there are drugs which are uppers and drugs which are downers. And so stimulants are clearly drugs which are uppers, give you energy, give you various properties of being overstimulated. Again, about the dose, if you get the dose right, you can become charming and, people get more confident. The dose goes higher, you get many of the more physiological complications of using these drugs. So if we look at the words, stimulant, it's a type of drug which is going to give you that effect similar to cocaine or amphetamines. Cathinone is a particular structural class. In itself, it's not particularly interesting, but it's a group of drugs have this same structure, and there may be some similarities across the drugs with that similarity. But actually what happens when you tweak a little, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of drugs like this now, and as the chemists have put together new drugs, they've put new little chemical structures at various places that can completely change the way these drugs behave in human bodies. And so actually, the structure is not so interesting because you can't really tell how this drug is going to behave from the structure until it goes into humans. You don't really know. But the cathinone is about that kind of structure. It's synthetic, it's made in a laboratory, it's not come from a plant. Relatively new, it's not a classical drug like amphetamine and methamphetamine, been around for a long time. Alpha PVP seems to have been something created the last 20, 25 years.
You've mentioned it being a stimulant, and if the dose is right, it may bring about effects that the user might find to be pleasant. Why would someone take alpha PVP? Can you tell us more about that? What are the desired effects from taking this drug?
I don't really know about why someone would choose alpha PVP. In the UK, it doesn't seem people use it very much. There was a time it was used widely in the Russian town where that study comes from. I don't know why people might choose alpha PVP in particular. I don't think it has any property which is particularly different to the other ones.
And to your knowledge, does it have a street name?
It might do, but they change all the time.
And to your knowledge, is it ever used to cut other drugs?
I've not heard of that happening.
So the chair has before him a statement, which is part of the evidence in the case, from a man called James Hume, who's a substance misuse harm reduction worker from the Fife area, who back in 2015 gave a statement saying that the local drug takers had little or no knowledge of alpha PVP, and that he was aware that it was getting mixed with other controlled drugs, including MDMA and coke, to bulk it up to make bigger profit margins. So the dealers were making a profit, and the abusers didn't realise what they were taking and how serious the effects could be. Does that come as a surprise to you?
Well, that would suggest to me that alpha PVP was cheaper to make than the other drugs. You either eat cheaper to make or cheaper to obtain, or somehow you wouldn't bulk up cocaine with something that's more expensive than cocaine. So therefore, it suggests that somehow the supply of alpha PVP was allowing people providing drugs to mix it with drugs, which is more expensive drugs, and therefore it has a similar effect to cocaine, and perhaps cocaine was more expensive at that time. That would be the only reason I could think of bulking things out, generally using cheaper things.
I'd like to read to you a very short extract from a report prepared by, a statement given by another expert who said there are 11 different forms of alpha PVP. The laboratory did not test to distinguish which form it was. Why is that important? Well, because some types of alpha PVP are more than 1,500 times more powerful than others. You haven't heard that before.
No.
That comes from the statement of a Stephen Karsh, but can I invite your comment on that?
So the chemical structures have various, we call them isomers. So they have the same chemicals in there, but each time there's a link, it might go off in the left direction or a right direction. And so therefore, when you have a compound with multiple different things joining in, there may be different variations of it because of the direction which way the compounds come off. I mean, we have this in medicines as well. There are some medicines where there's a left and a right form, and the left form is the most potent. So now we've got rid of the right form for medicines, and we only have the medicines purely made for the left form. For example, escitalopram would be an example where we still use citalopram, but some people like escitalopram, which is the one of one, I can't remember if the right or the left. So this is quite well known in medicine. To have 11 different forms suggests it's quite a complex structure to have these different angles going off. Yes, I could imagine they could be more potent in their interactions. I'm not aware of it. But the principle seems reasonable.
Thank you. In your in your statement, if we can move down to paragraph 78, you talk about what you call the side effects of alpha PVP. And you reference the Swedish Strida project, which lists the common side effects of alpha PVP. And you say that tachycardia is the most common side effect, and you explain that is where the heart beats very fast. If a person wants to run off because they're being chased, they would want their heart to go faster, since this means that you breathe faster and you can therefore run faster. If a normal resting heart rate is, for example, 70 beats per minute, you would want your heart rate to increase to 120 beats per minute when running. As a stimulant drug, alpha PVP replicates this effect on the body. However, if your heart rate rises too high, for example, to 180 beats per minute, this is hazardous. Evidence recently in this inquiry about arrhythmias, and I wonder if you can help us to understand the difference between tachycardia and an arrhythmia.
So tachycardia has a rhythm. So arrhythmias or dysrhythmias, this means a chaotic rhythm or an absence of a rhythm. Tachycardia, you still have the rhythm. So your heart has got two chambers, two double chambers, and what you want is the first one to push blood from the atrium into the ventricle, and then the ventricle to go out. And that takes time. And the faster you get, the more difficult that process is. And if it's chaotic, they're not beating in order, in rhythm. By going in rhythm, the heart works well. So having a heart rate of 120, 140, I could probably sit there in front of you and function completely normally. When you get to 180, that's a normal rhythm, but it's very fast. And so the heart's not really having time to fill properly in between beats. When it's chaotic or a dysrhythmia, you don't get this rhythm. So the electricity of the heart is changed, the rhythm's not there, and the heart doesn't work, and the blood doesn't come out of it very well. We talk about something called ventricular fibrillation, which is it's a chaotic heart rhythm. There is no effective function going on at all. There's just the electricity through your heart is all over the place. We need the electricity in the heart to be nice and rhythmic to cause the heart to work well and the blood to flow through it properly.
Thank you. And paragraph 79. You explain that there's relatively little data on the cause of death in patients dying after exposure to alpha PVP only. Mm-hmm. That means, I think, not in combination with other drugs, and that it's not clear whether alpha PVP commonly causes very fast or chaotic heart rhythms, causing cardiac arrests.
Yes, that's true. But that's partly because we don't have a lot of data on alpha PVP. The best case series is from the Russian city, but also people are tending to, if you die in hospital on a monitor, we know what's going on. When you're dying in the community as a result of an interaction or as a result of the drug itself, we have no way of looking at what's going on in the body. So it's very hard for us to tell what's truly happened. The pathologists will try and make a guess, an estimate, or use their skills to try to say what happened before the death. But it is quite difficult when people are dying in the community.
You say very little is known for the reasons you've explained, but you referred to a Russian study. Could you tell us just a little about that?
It'd be lovely if you could show me the paragraph that was in. But there was a city called Yekaterinburg,
Yes.
which is a city in Russia where they had a drug problem, and that drug problem on analysis turned out to be alpha PVP. And this is by far the biggest case series I've seen anywhere in the world where this particular drug became a problem, which simply meant a supplier started supplying that drug. And there was a study done of these patients, and they looked at patients who they managed to get blood samples because they came to hospital, and they found that some patients only had alpha PVP, and others had alpha PVP plus MDMA and other drugs. And they were able to look and find out things like psychosis, and particularly looking at psychosis, what was the frequency of psychosis in patients just with alpha PVP in their blood versus patients who had alpha PVP and other drugs. And this was presented, and I don't think it's been published. A colleague of mine was involved with the Russian toxicologists, and they presented it at a meeting, and I had the copy of those slides.
I think you referenced this at paragraph 77.
Thank you.
This is your colleague David Wood,
That's right.
and it's the Yekaterinburg
You
study.
pronounce it better than I do. Thank you.
And you explain in this paragraph that the point that you're trying to make in your report is that patients who've taken alpha PVP are more likely to show psychosis than the control subjects who had not taken alpha PVP, 63.9% versus 35.7% in the
Yeah.
study, and the presence and absence of other drugs did not affect the incidence of psychosis.
Yes.
So what then would you take from that study, or invite us to take from that study?
That alpha PVP has a particular risk of causing psychosis, more than most of the other drugs we recognize, and really a remarkably high rate of psychosis.
If we can scroll down a little bit as far as paragraph 80, please. You mention a cluster of related symptoms. We've spoken about the tachycardia, which you say is the most common side effect. In paragraph 80, you explain that the second most common side effect is agitation.
Mm-hmm.
If a person is being chased, they want to be aware of their surroundings. The person becomes more alert, their pupils dilate, and they're taking in more information. Agitation might be considered a level above alertness. The person is looking around, may not be quite sure of what's going on, and puzzled. The brain is overstimulated. You go on at paragraph 81 to explain that delirium and hallucinations are also side effects, although less common than tachycardia and agitation. Delirium is very similar to agitation, with the addition of confusion of not understanding what's going on. You can't respond to stimuli and often have delusional thinking. You're thinking everyone's attacking you when they're not. With hallucinations, you're getting strange visions and sensations because the brain synapses are being overstimulated. And continuing on to paragraph 82, you talk about intense paranoia also being a side effect of alpha PVP. And again, you say if you're being chased by someone, being a bit paranoid is probably quite a good thing. Looking around, being really worried about what's going to happen, that'll help you escape. But it becomes too much in these cases. You're overstimulated, and because you're paranoid, you're quite often violent and aggressive, so you see the world attacking you, you're in fight or flight mode. Therefore, you start fighting against whatever you come across. What's quite clear when you're like this is that you can't process instructions. And for completeness, can we look briefly at paragraph 119 of your statement? Where you say, sorry, I think I've got the wrong paragraph number here, but you will correct me if I'm wrong. I think you do say in your statement that you know that alpha PVP causes a very high rate of agitation and psychosis,
Yes.
which is effectively what you said earlier and what should be taken from the Russian study by your colleague David Wood.
Yes. And also the point that the presence of other drugs doesn't seem to increase or reduce it particularly.
Thank you. We heard evidence last week from Dr. Maurice Lipsitch, and I think in fact you were provided with a copy of his report by the Crown, and you had it available to you when you prepared your report for the Crown Office. He is, of course, a psychiatrist, but he treats patients who are suffering from psychostimulant intoxication, and he was asked about alpha PVP. What I would like to do is just tell you what he had to say about alpha PVP and then invite your comment.
Okay.
So he said that alpha PVP was a very powerful stimulant, like a very, very potent form of amphetamine. Amphetamine has the potential to cause extreme paranoia fairly quickly. Within 20 minutes, 45 minutes, it acts quickly. It doesn't do that to everybody, but in a person who happens to be susceptible, there can be a paranoid reaction which can be extreme. Would you agree or disagree with that evidence?
I would agree. I think the interesting question is there a dose effect, which I don't think we know. So if we take the average person and put the dose higher and higher in that person, will they all become paranoid at the end? Or is it true that what he's saying is that only some people are more likely to get paranoid, and we don't really know. It's quite hard to distinguish the two. I think they're both. I think it's if you've been paranoid before, and you're at higher risk of becoming paranoid with something else. So someone with a history of paranoia who takes a drug that causes paranoia is probably, again the word is probably, more likely to get paranoid. But it's quite possible that there is a dose response as well, and as you get so supremely stimulated, you go through agitation up to levels of paranoia and delusions.
And what difference, if any, does it make if an individual is a naive user or a more chronic user?
I can't answer that question.
And can you say whether over time a user of alpha PVP would likely build up a tolerance, or could the reverse be true? Could they become sensitized to the drug?
I don't think we have the data to answer that. I mean, both are perfectly reasonable possibilities.
Again, I'd like to tell you what Dr. Lipsitch said in relation to sensitization to alpha PVP, and simply invite your comment. He explained that sensitization is the opposite to habituation. He gave an analogy with alcohol. A person might become more tolerant to the effects of alcohol, able to drink increasing amounts with less undesirable effects. He said that sensitization is the opposite to that. So with successive exposure to alpha PVP, the brain reacts increasingly in a negative way, with increasing risk of the intoxication and an increasing risk of paranoia, suspicion and violence.
Okay.
So I would simply invite your comment. I wonder whether you would agree or disagree with what Dr. Lipsitch said in his evidence, albeit he's coming from the perspective of a psychiatrist and not a toxicologist.
Yes. So I come from a perspective of acute exposures generally. I'm not dealing with people who are taking a routine dose, a daily dose, etc. I'm dealing with when they come to a crisis and they end up in hospital, or dealing with the ambulance services in the community. So I wouldn't have the knowledge to be able to comment on what he said. It sounds fine.
Are you able to assist us on the basis of your clinical experience as to how long it would take a user to feel the effects of alpha PVP?
I mean, no. Because, I mean, people are taking so many mixed drugs and they come in. And also from my own personal clinical experience, I've never known if I treat anyone with alpha PVP, because we're not analysing their blood to know which of the many drugs out there they're taking. So I don't know if this is an alpha PVP patient. Occasionally people come and say, I've taken MDMA. You're a bit skeptical because they could have taken so many things. No one's ever said to me, I've taken alpha PVP. And I don't think the literature I've seen is clear enough about how long it would take. But clearly 15, 20, 30 minutes is a time frame which is reasonable for many of these drugs.
And the reason that you are unlikely to know what drug is in a person's system, I think, and we'll discuss this in more detail later, but it's because, as you explain in your statement, you treat patients symptomatically, because it takes weeks to get the results of blood tests back.
Exactly. And also they've taken many drugs. We do a study at the moment where we 6 weeks later we get the results back, and many have taken 5, 6, 7 or 8 drugs. So they're dealing with a mixture of what they've taken.
Will all users of alpha PVP experience the negative side effects?
I don't know.
Are you able to assist us with how long it takes for the effects of alpha PVP to wear off?
No, I don't. Again, alpha PVP, I don't know specifically enough. It varies by people, it varies by dose, it probably varies by how much you're using over time. It's very variable by person.
If you happened to know, perhaps because the patient told you, that you were treating a patient intoxicated with alpha PVP, what would be your first line treatment?
Well, first of all, we'd have to work out what level of illness they are. People can come into hospital and they're quite well, but most people who come to hospital will be agitated and distressed and stimulated by the drug, and the first line treatment would always be a benzodiazepine. I would typically use diazepam, others might use lorazepam or midazolam. These are drugs which overstimulate a receptor called the GABA A receptor and cause the brain to calm down. And that would be our first line drug, try and get this on top of the situation. Hopefully we'd give tablets, depends if they're willing to take tablets. And again, it's about talking to the patient, trying to persuade them to take it. Otherwise, you might give it through the arm if they were really particularly agitated. Through the vein, sorry, in the arm.
And again, later this morning, I'm going to ask you in some detail about the clinical management of patients who have taken stimulant drugs. But for now, if we can stay with the effects of alpha PVP, you were asked in your statement if you could comment on the fatal range, and if we can perhaps bring up paragraph 84. You say that there's no precise range identified for fatal cases, and you refer to 2 studies, and reading those studies together, the range appears to be from 1.1 microgram per litre of blood to more than 20,000
Yes.
micrograms per litre of blood. That seems to me as a layperson to be a very wide range.
Absolutely.
As you are aware, and this is referred to, of course, in your inquiry statement, that the level of alpha PVP within Shekubio's blood was 70,
Yes.
which you observe at paragraph 88 falls within the reported range of fatal concentrations, albeit at the lower end of the range.
Yes.
And you say at paragraph 88, please, I would have said that Mr. Bio was in the lower range of these case examples, but still very consistent. By consistent, do you mean still within the range?
Yes.
In terms of the reported cases?
Can I say one thing here?
Yes.
So if we look at there are many drugs which have been around for a long time, and many of them being found in patients who have died and patients who have not died. For example, police pull people over by the side of the road, they take blood samples. So over time, and there's a couple of papers which list 1,000 different drugs, medicines and drugs, looking at fatal, they look at doses you might find therapeutic, the dose you might find in people being ill, and the dose of death. So when I say in alpha PVP we don't have those ranges, they exist for many other drugs, but still they're very broad. They're not very different to this, even though it looks strange, as we see, it's not different to anything else. And it comes back again to the fact that if I take a medicine, it's been trialed in humans. You know, the first time this medicine comes out, it goes into human. We watch it really carefully. We measure how it gets handled in the body, whether it comes in your urine or whether your liver breaks it down. We have that information. And once we've done it once with the first dose, we're really carefully done, we then increase the dose. And you might go through 6 or 7 different doses, but each time we're taking blood concentrations from the people, nearly always young men, nearly always men, because of reproductive in women. We wouldn't expose a woman to a new medicine routinely because of the risk of problems with an unborn child. So, but then we may have 8 people, and they've got 8 increased doses, and by the end of that, we've got lovely information about what is a dose which has an effect, what's toxic. But these drugs go into humans without any of that process. We have no idea what concentrations are working. So when people are at home taking these drugs and not coming to hospital, I don't know what the concentrations are in the blood. I don't know what's a good concentration, what's a bad concentration. All we have in these people is if they have a problem, they come to hospital. If they come to hospital alive, or the police find them and take a blood sample because of driving, then we'll have some ballpark for that. And then we have the concentrations from the deaths. Now, again, they'll often have multiple drugs, like Mr. Bayo had multiple drugs, but I think this is the most important one. The ranges we have, sometimes it's just one drug, sometimes it's 2 or 3 drugs. Sometimes the 2 or 3 drugs are important, sometimes they're not. Sometimes the blood samples are taken in a post-mortem 3 days after they've died, where things could have happened to those concentrations in the meantime. Sometimes they're taken in hospital 2 days before they die. It's kind of chaotic. We're trying to get information which makes sense and kind of comes together to give us some information to say, well, it looks like it's probably about right. But that's the only level of information we can offer, because they've never been put into humans in any controlled fashion at all. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. That's very helpful. Thank you. And in paragraph 88 of your statement, you say that on the basis of the studies and taking into consideration the limited research and writing around the subject, which you've just explained to us, Mr. Bayo's blood concentration of 70 micrograms per litre of blood is not inconsistent with the fatal dose. And then you conclude that paragraph by saying, that being said, the surrounding circumstances of the death should not be ignored. What did you mean by that final sentence?
So Mr. Bayo was restrained at the time and was very agitated and was had no understanding of what was going on, I think. He appeared, and Dr. Lepsedge's comment was that he was psychotic at the time. So the blood concentration is related. So the fatal dose will be related to how the person died, effectively. Sometimes we have people who are left alone in the room, and no one touches them, and they're found dead in the room. And those concentrations might tell us that that drug ranged by itself, with that person just sitting there calmly like I'm doing now, is enough to kill you. Or it might say that person was very, very sensitive, and for some reason we don't understand yet, that drug interacted badly with that person. But in that situation, that blood concentration is saying this is a lethal dose for that person in a calm situation. Mr. Bayo was not in a calm situation, he was also restrained. It's possible, because of the restraint, he died at a lower dose than would have been expected if he hadn't been restrained and had survived or had died for another reason.
Thank you. I want to move on to ask you some questions now about MDMA. And again, if we could perhaps pull up paragraph 95 of your report. Again, we all have your statement and can read it at our leisure, but from paragraphs 95 to 100, you explain the type of drug that MDMA is and the various effects that it can have. You say at paragraph 95, and again it's a copy from your report, MDMA is a widely used entactogenic phenylethylamine drug. It causes hyperstimulation of the central and autonomic nervous systems via increased release and reduced uptake of serotonin, as well as dopamine and norepinephrine.
Norepinephrine.
Thank you. There are lots of quite technical words in there. Can you perhaps introduce us to MDMA and tell us a little bit about the drug?
So entactogenic is the word below, which means touching within. And this idea that some drugs, such as MDMA, which work predominantly on the serotonin system in our brain, causes emotional openness, affection, empathy at the right dose. Again, it's always about the dose. And the dose varies by people. It's a phenylethylamine against a structure. It happens to come from that kind of structure and has been changed to create this particular drug. So the way to think about them, in our brains we have lots of synapses and lots of neurotransmitters. And some key ones, serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is the fight or flight one in particular. So that's really stimulating your norepinephrine. It's mostly more new dopamine. Dopamine is about reward systems, and serotonin, very key for depression and for your mood. So when we have this is a nerve that's trying to send a message from one nerve to either the muscle or the nerve at the other side. And so they're very, very close together. And the area they meet we call the synapse. And what happens is this nerve gets stimulated, electric current comes along, and it releases neurotransmitter, which goes across to the other side. Now, you want some way to stop that effect. You don't want that neurotransmitter to be released and then work for the next 3 weeks. It's going to have to work in a very short time, probably milliseconds. So as a result of that, there are mechanisms in this synapse, the junction between we call this the pre-terminal nerve ending, and then the post-synaptic nerve ending here. There are mechanisms in place to bring that to an end quite quickly. And the typical ways, so when the neurotransmitter comes out, it binds to receptors on the other side. So the signal comes electric, causes the nerve to release neurotransmitter. That goes across a very, very small passageway, binds to the postsynaptic, to a receptor, and then has an effect, and an electric current will go on. So that's how they join to each other and how the brain talks to itself. So what happens with drugs like MDMA? It affects this mechanism for ending it and causes it to keep going. So there's two key ones, one of which is the main one is about a transporter which takes it back up into the pre-terminal synapse. So it's gone out, the neurotransmitter's gone out, it's called serotonin. Serotonin comes out, binds to its receptor, then comes off, and you get rid of it by taking it back up. So fluoxetine or many antidepressants block that mechanism of getting rid of it. So therefore you have a longer effect of serotonin. What happens with some of these drugs actually increases every time something happens there, you have a certain amount comes out. You take some drugs, it causes it to come out without the nerve happening, and also a larger amount will come out. So you get overstimulation of the receptors at the other side. So you overstimulate because you've got more of this neurotransmitter present, because more is being released and less is being taken back up. And this is how these drugs generally work. Serotonin, MDMA particularly works at the serotonin synapse, which is why we find the effects of it are more about mood. Other drugs will work more at the norepinephrine. So cocaine, for example, I think is more dopamine and norepinephrine. Each of these drugs have slightly different patterns of where in the brain and which particular synapses they're going to work on. But the general idea is they're causing overstimulation by either preventing the uptake or increasing the release. That's how these work.
And what are the consequences of that?
Will depend on the drug, depend on the pattern of the synapses. So in MDMA, at a dose that people find beneficial, you have this affection, emotional openness, enhanced sociability. It was kind of the clubber's drug because suddenly everybody found you charming and exciting and a really nice person to hang out with. That was what MDMA is used for. But there are problems with MDMA. There's something called sort of perseveration. So people, they're told to drink water because they get hot in the club. And so they keep drinking, and they keep drinking, and they keep drinking because their brain tells them to keep doing that. They're not thinking what they're doing, and they can actually die from drinking too much water. And that's quite well recognized. Then you have seizures from that. These drugs are often not pure. Sometimes the dose is much higher. I think in the past, 25 to 50 milligrams was a standard tablet. It suddenly went up to 250. And so people were having consequences of these higher doses. Higher doses, you find toxicity, which predominantly is the temperature goes up. So what we worry about when a patient like this comes to hospital, we'll measure the temperature. And if it's something like 39, 40, 41, we immediately start trying to bring the temperature down. Because the high temperature, which is caused by this overstimulation, particularly of the nerve to the muscle junction, not the nerve, but the nerve muscle, your muscles become really overstimulated. And particularly if you've been dancing all night, your muscles are creating too much heat. And if your body can't get rid of it, you will die from being too hot. As a result of that, your clotting stops working, your liver stops working. So the predominant problem of this overstimulated effect is too much temperature. You're too hot. So we will put you in an ice bucket and cool you down. And that is what we're doing. For example, in cocaine in New York, they have something called the Love Parade, and everyone takes cocaine on it apparently. And it's 35 degrees centigrade in New York in August. It's not a great time to take stimulant drugs. They'll come into hospital. Immediately they'll be sedated with the benzodiazepine drug we talked about before, and there's a metal bath, the classical metal tub. You get put in there, covered with ice, covered with water, and your temperature comes down really quickly and you survive. If your temperature goes up to 41 or high, there's a 50% chance of dying. So, yes.
Thank you. That detailed explanation. If we can perhaps turn to paragraph 106 of your statement.
Is this the level of information you want? Let's ask this. You should guide me more.
But no, rest assured that either I or the chair will soon interrupt if it's not the level of information that is found to be helpful. At paragraph 106, you explain that MDMA commonly causes tachycardia and high blood pressure, and cardiomyopathy can occur with chronic use. Cardiac arrests do occur, but rarely, probably due to constriction of the arteries supplying the heart with blood, causing myocardia, ischemia, or infarction. And you say at paragraph 107 that MDMA use is not associated with direct lung damage or with respiratory arrest. And in fact, I think, and we don't need to go to it, but at paragraph 83 of your report, you also say in relation to alpha PVA that there are no reports that allow a conclusion to be drawn that alpha PVP could cause damage to the respiratory system. So neither of these drugs appear to have a direct effect, so far as you are concerned as a toxicologist, on the lungs or the respiratory system. Now, again, I'd like to read to you another small passage from Dr. Lipsich's evidence about MDMA, just for your comment, because you both treat patients suffering from MDMA intoxication, but from slightly different perspectives. Dr. Lipsich told us, normally ecstasy or MDMA is a stimulant. It's not generally associated with severely adverse psychiatric effects. There are some reports of it causing paranoia, but that's unusual. The more general impact in terms of the way an individual who has taken ecstasy would relate to others is actually they may feel better disposed than usual to other people. It's a drug that's usually taken in nightclubs, and people take it partly because it is actually thought to generate feelings of non-aggression and friendliness rather than paranoia. However, there are some reports, but this is rare, of it having the opposite effect. Would you agree or disagree with Dr. Lipsich's evidence?
So I agree. It depends on your definition of rareness. So the large case series from Euronet, they reckoned that psychosis was about 4%. We've talked about alpha BP being 65%, and other drugs in that case was about 35%. The best data we have on MDMA is that it's uncommon. It seems not to be quite as rare as that, but it's very much the lower end.
Are you able to comment on how long it takes, or how long it would take a user to feel the effects of MDMA?
Not based on my clinical practice, because I see them at the other end. If I go onto Erovid and look at the websites there, you're talking, half an hour would be a time. It's also about the level. You may start getting early effects, and it takes longer to become fully effect. Half an hour to an hour would be quite common for a drug to be absorbed and have its effect.
And will all users experience the more negative side effects of MDMA?
I don't know. No, I don't.
Does it make a difference if a user's taken a small dose or a larger dose?
I think so, because when the tablets started becoming 250 rather than 50, there seemed to be more patients coming to hospital. So I think there is clearly everything is always the dose. So it seems that the higher the dose, the more likely you are to get problems. But there may be differences in sensitivity. Perhaps people have different receptors which bind, or different transporters which the MD may interact with differently. We don't know.
And would it make a difference if a user was a naive user or a chronic user?
That's the kind of question Dr. Lipsich is more likely to be able to answer, because I don't see patients. I'm dealing with the acute crisis rather than their long-term use of the drug.
With MDMA, would you expect, from your perspective as a toxicologist, that over time a user would build up tolerance, or conversely might they become sensitized to the drug? Don't know. What would be your first line of treatment if you were presented with someone who you knew was intoxicated as a result of MDMA?
Again, it'd be about looking at what their clinical condition was. If they were agitated, which is the likely reason why they would come to hospital, because most wouldn't come to hospital, we'd use benzodiazepines. If their temperature was going up, we were extremely worried, again, we'd sedate them with benzodiazepines and then do things to cool them down. We might use ice, we might use some medicines which keep the temperature down.
Is there a known fatal range for MDMA?
There are records where those ranges are put into the literature. I don't have it on me at the moment. I have it in my laptop. But again, they're very broad. You wouldn't say confidently this was definitely a fatal and this was definitely not a fatal. They will overlap.
And again, is it very variable and person-specific in the way that the response to alpha-PVP is variable and person-specific?
It seems to be. I mean, we have people who take a single tablet and die, and it's not quite clear why that happens, whether it's what they took or whether it's their body's response to what they took. I think the body's response is definitely a key part of that, because when we look in their blood afterwards and find what were the drugs they've taken, sometimes it is only MDMA, and sometimes they've died, and it's not clear why.
I'd like to read to you a very short extract from the evidence of Dr. Shearer, from whom we heard last week. Dr. Shearer, of course, was the pathologist who performed the autopsy on the body of Shekabayo. And in relation to alpha-PVP and MDMA, she said they are both stimulant drugs, and by stimulant drugs I mean they can have an effect on the cardiovascular system, so they can cause an increase in heart rate and an increase in blood pressure, and they can also cause arrhythmias. With any stimulant drugs, that is one of the extreme complications.
Mm-hmm.
So again, can I simply invite your comment? It'd be helpful to know whether you would agree or disagree from your perspective as a clinical toxicologist.
So they're both stimulants, so they both can cause them, but I think it'd be much more common. Well, we don't see patients presenting with fast heart rates commonly with MDMA, but perhaps they're not coming to hospital. We can only see who come to hospital. So while MDMA is a stimulant, compared to cocaine, for example, it seems to be far less toxic, so much less common. I don't know how common alpha-PVP is, because it's just not a commonly used drug, and the records are really only from Russia. What was the key feature there was it was a psychosis rather than severe tachycardias, etc., that was the problem.
Thank you. Can I ask you a question or two about alpha-PVP and MDMA when taken in combination? Can you comment on the effects when those two drugs are taken in combination? Are the effects compounded?
It seems not. Again, the literature is very limited. It'd be lovely to do studies where you give people both and look at how they respond. It's probably not ethical. I mean, those kind of studies will give that answer. We don't have them. So the only literature we have is from Yekaterinburg, where blood samples were taken and they looked at the concentrations of these drugs and they looked at how the patients present. It was a very nice study. And what was quite clear was it seemed to make no difference whether MDMA was in the body or not in terms of psychosis in particular. I can't remember the data precisely for tachycardias, but it seemed to be that alpha-PVP was a dominant drug, and anything else was not really important in terms of the clinical presentation. So adding the MDMA to the alpha-PVP doesn't seem to make a difference.
And where a person is known to have both alpha-PVP and MDMA in their system, is there any way that you as a toxicologist can determine whether those drugs were taken together or separately?
No. But clearly there are options. People do take drugs, sometimes they take two different ones, but often they're contaminated with each other and you have no idea.
I'd like to move on to ask you questions now about the anabolic steroid nandrolone. And I believe that you were sent, I think by the Crown, a copy of a report prepared by a Dr. Walker, an analyst from King's College in London, which confirmed that he'd analysed a urine sample taken from Shekabayo and found nandrolone and its metabolites to be present, and offered the view that the results were consistent with the recent administration of the anabolic steroid nandrolone.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little about nandrolone?
It's an anabolic steroid commonly used by bodybuilders, and it's associated with cardiovascular complications. With chronic use, it's not a very safe drug to use. I don't think acutely, we don't consider it acutely toxic. So if someone takes it recently, we wouldn't expect that to affect their clinical presentation with any other drugs. If someone's taking it long term, there can be various complications of taking steroids.
So what physiological effects then would taking nandrolone have on a person?
It might cause, it causes muscle buildup. It may give you higher blood pressure. maybe potentially a risk of psychosis. I mean, we know that steroids are associated with psychosis, so it's possible that taking it long term would make you more at risk.
Can we look at paragraph 137 of your statement, please? You say that you look to Talkspace for guidance on the link between nandrolone use and cardiac arrhythmias.
Mm-hmm.
Toxicity following acute overdose of these steroids is expected to be low. Chronic exposure may lead to serious symptoms, including cardiovascular effects. Deaths associated with chronic use usually have a cardiovascular cause, with findings at autopsy.
Yes.
And in paragraph 138, you say that chronic use may have caused Chekabayo's heart to be pathologically more prone to problems.
Yes. But, yes. I mean, if it had been severe, you would have seen that at post-mortem, and nothing was really seen at post-mortem. So it's possible that chronic nandrolone use may have caused his heart to behave differently under the effects of the other drugs, but there was no clear evidence for that from the post-mortem.
So what effect would you expect if a person had nandrolone in their system and then they took alpha-PVP and MDMA in addition to the nandrolone?
And the cause of death, so the chronic use of nandrolone may make your heart more sensitive to have dysrhythmias. I don't think you would see anything in the heart. You might see the nandrolone effect, but you wouldn't see any effect of the alpha-PVP or the MDMA. There's nothing there present at post-mortem.
Again, I'd like to share with you a little extract from Dr. Lipsige's evidence in relation to nandrolone, simply for your comment. He said, these anabolic or bodybuilding steroids, there have been quite a lot of reports of them causing aggressive behaviour. However, more recent research suggests that the earlier papers tended to overlook the possibility that the bodybuilder was taking stimulant drugs at the same time. That is to say, drugs like amphetamine. And amphetamine in large doses can cause violence, aggression, hostility, paranoia, and so on. So the early reports didn't disentangle the possibility that it wasn't just the steroids, the bodybuilding steroids, but it could have been other drugs that were being taken at the same time and which were being commonly used by bodybuilders. Mm-hmm. Again, can I just invite your comment on that evidence?
I defer to him and his knowledge of people using nandrolone in particular. We know that people taking steroids, so medical steroids like prednisolone or dexamethasone, psychosis is a clear and common side effect of it. So while those studies didn't disentangle the two, I don't think that means nandrolone couldn't have been involved in it. Steroids can cause psychosis, but many bodybuilders are using multiple drugs. So again, to tease out which individual particular drug makes it more likely is difficult. It's often about consistency, and it's not unreasonable to think that nandrolone may have increased his risk of psychosis with the alpha-PVP.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time.
A convenient point to take a break. We'll take a 20-minute break. Ms. Thompson.
Professor Eddleston, can I move on now to ask you some questions about alcohol? And can I begin by asking you to describe the physiological effects of alcohol?
Okay. So alcohol is a GABA-A agonist, if we're going to talk pharmacologically. So this is a type of, this is a receptor throughout the body, but in the brain in particular. It's a downer. So when the GABA binds to this receptor, more chloride goes through into the cell, and the cell becomes calmer and less likely to do things effectively. So what alcohol does is the same thing as GABA. So benzodiazepines are also GABA agonists, meaning drugs which interact with the GABA receptor and calm things down, which is why we give benzodiazepines. I'll come back in a moment. We give benzodiazepines to people with seizures, so we're trying to calm the brain down. So that's what GABAs do, the GABA receptors involved in. So alcohol stimulates these receptors, and what it seems to do in the frontal part of the brain, it interacts with different receptors in different parts of the brain at different doses. So that when you start drinking alcohol, it stimulates the GABA receptors in the frontal parts of your brain. And the frontal part of your brain is about control. It's about executive functions, making sure you do really sensible things in places like this. With alcohol, you lose that. So you become a little bit more freer. People think they become more charming with a couple of glasses of wine. And that's because the frontal lobe's gone. And as you have more and more alcohol, you start getting more and more suppression of your brain function until you end up comatose at certain amounts. The amount of alcohol you drink chronically will determine how well you can handle the acute drink you have, the drink you have today. So if you have lots every day, you can handle alcohol really easily. If you don't drink very much, you'll have more effect from the alcohol you have today. And there's clearly variability by people.
Thank you. Does alcohol have an effect, chronic or acute, on the heart?
Yes. It causes a cardiomyopathy. It damages the heart in chronic use.
What is a cardiomyopathy?
So cardio, heart, myo, muscle, pathy, not working. So you put the three together, it's the heart muscle not working terribly well. And there's various types of that. So taking steroids for a long time will cause a cardiomyopathy. Taking alcohol excessively will cause a cardiomyopathy. I'm not a pathologist, and I can't particularly tell you the mechanism it does that, but we recognize that having chronic, heavy alcohol use will make the heart more prone to problems.
What would you anticipate the effect would be if a person took alcohol in combination with stimulant drugs?
So, alcohol is a downer. It stimulates the GABAs, and therefore your brain gets quieter. Stimulant drugs cause an upper. So it's going to be a mixture of effects and will depend on which particular drug you've taken, the doses of them, the timing of them, will all determine what it would have. One might imagine that alcohol would dull the stimulant effects of the other drugs and kind of make them less severe. One problem is that chronic alcohol use changes how your liver handles various drugs. And so if by taking alcohol every day for a year, changes your liver's ability to handle one of these stimulants, it may make the stimulant worse or may make it better. Depends on the drug, depends on the time. It's very variable. But it's reasonable to say that the alcohol may make the effect of the stimulant less severe.
How quickly is alcohol metabolized?
I don't know the exact times of that. I mean, so most drugs are metabolized or broken down according to the concentration in your blood. We talk about half-lives. So you get rid of a drug, say amphetamines, you get rid of it, you go from this to half of this in a certain time point. It's called a half-life. With alcohol, it's not like that. So the concentration you have in your body doesn't determine how quickly you get rid of it. Because in most other drugs, the more you have in the body, the more you get rid of. With alcohol, you get rid of 1 unit per hour on roughly. But individuals will change somewhat, will vary between different individuals. But if you drink 8 units, I'm not sure how many shots of vodka that is, but that's going to give you a certain number of hours. It's going to give you around 8 hours to get rid of it, 6 hours to 8 hours. But there's variability between people.
There were reports that Shekabio consumed alcohol over the course of the evening and the night before his encounter with the police. However, blood and urine screens were negative for alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
Can you help us to understand why that might be?
It would suggest the time interval between the blood sample being taken and the alcohol being ingested was more than the number of units that had been taken. So if you take 5 units over 5 hours, each hour you're getting rid of a unit, so you're kind of gradually, you haven't got a very high concentration. If you take a lot, 6 or 7 units in one go, it goes high and takes 6 or 7 hours to come down. So if you look after 6 hours, you may see no evidence. Again, that's a rule for the whole population, that 1 unit per hour. There's clear variabilities between people. And that's partly about how much you drink routinely.
So is that another way of saying that the alcohol potentially was metabolized by the time the blood and urine samples were taken?
Yes, I should have said that, I agree.
I think I might have been quoting Dr. Shearer there, Professor Eddleston, in fairness. She gave evidence to the inquiry when asked a similar question, that alcohol is metabolized reasonably quickly, and that could explain the negative blood and urine screens.
Very easily. I mean, if you take 2 units, 4 or 5 hours later, there's nothing left in the body.
Can I move on to ask you just a few questions about caffeine?
Okay, yes.
Can you tell us a little about caffeine?
It's a stimulant. It's an adenosine receptor agonist, so it has a different mechanism to amphetamines, but it's also a stimulant, causes increased I could have read this up before I came, I think. It's a similar, it works with a different mechanism to amphetamines. It's not working at the dopamine receptors. It's working via adenosine receptors, I think, and it's simply a stimulant which we become addicted to. And therefore, in the morning when you wake up and you need your cup of coffee, you're dealing with your dependence.
Does it have an effect on the heart?
Yes, so any stimulant will cause a tachycardia, an increased rate of the heart. If someone takes, so now we have these caffeine tablets, or we have Red Bull with large amounts, and people become extremely sick and die now from caffeine overdoses by taking caffeine tablets in particular. And if you take too many Red Bulls, you can become quite sick. So I'll try to speak slower. And people die from cardiac problems if they take too much caffeine. So the heart goes into a chaotic rhythm, and you will die, and very, very difficult to treat if you take too many caffeine tablets.
I think you may be aware that a supplementary toxicology report was prepared in this case, and it confirmed analysis of Sheikh hospital and post-mortem blood for caffeine between levels of 1.6 and 2.2 micrograms per litre. Can you help us to understand the significance of caffeine being present in his blood at that level?
Not at that level in particular. I'm not sure what the concentrations are after people drink coffee, but we do know that caffeine is used to cut drugs. So caffeine being present in someone who dies from a drug overdose is not uncommon, and could easily be explained by a coffee being drunk before the time, or a Red Bull, or by having it present in the drugs they bought.
I'm going to move on to ask you questions about CS and PAVA spray. And again, if we could pull up your inquiry statement, please, and go to paragraph 130. While we're finding that, can you tell us a little about the physiological effects of these sprays on the human system?
So effectively they're irritants. They bind to receptors present in your mucosa and cause irritation. So if you leave it on long enough, the tissues would get damaged and potentially die. The effect of this is to cause lacrimation. So whenever we get irritated around our face, we start crying, we start getting rhinorrhea, so fluid coming out of our nose, as the cells of our linings start expressing fluid. I guess you could argue teleologically that it's trying to remove this nasty thing that's on there. And what happens is, if it's in your face, you would just cry a bit, and you probably, they're called tear gases. The idea is you close your eyes as you try to get the fluid out, and so you can't see what you're doing. It limits your ability to do things, why tear gas is used in crowd control. When you have too much, or the concentration is high and it goes into your lungs, then you have quite significant problems in the lungs. The mucosal lines of your lungs start responding to this irritant. The clinical problems with it tend to occur when you're in an enclosed room. There have been very few deaths from either CS or PAVA, But where they have happened, they've tended to be people who maybe already have a lung problem, and then they've been exposed to this gas in either in a constrained space or put into a constrained space after exposure and unable to clear their lungs with fresh air. Yeah.
Thank you. We now have paragraph 130 up, so if we could perhaps look at that. You say there are over 17,000 poisons listed on ToxBase. I'm aware that CS is not known to be a cardiotoxin. What is a cardiotoxin?
So heart toxin is a toxic substance. So a cardiotoxin is something that damages the heart, which you would expect to cause primary heart problems. Sorry.
So, no, thank you. CS is not known to be a cardiotoxin. I would not expect the level of exposure that Mr. Bio had to the CS or the PAVA to be a problem for his heart. But these are irritants. These are substances which work on your airways. If a person is sprayed with CS, their eyes are going to be streaming, their nose is going to be streaming. However, as long as they're not in a restricted space, they're probably going to be fine. And you mentioned a moment ago that the reported deaths generally involve individuals who've been in restricted spaces when exposed to these sprays. And you go on at paragraph 134 to offer an opinion that it's unlikely on balance that the sprays had an effect on Mr. Bio's heart. And at 135, you say that you don't think you've treated patients directly, but you have provided advice to clinicians over the phone where those clinicians have been dealing with patients who've been exposed to sprays.
Yes.
And further down at paragraph 136, you say that that advice is generally that it will settle with fresh air and observation, and that recovery is usually spontaneous and quick.
Yes.
Can we perhaps move away from your statement for a moment and bring up on the screen your report, the one that you prepared for the Crown Office? And can we go to paragraph 11, please? So you have a heading above this paragraph, psychiatric diagnosis. And as we discussed earlier, amongst the papers that were provided to you by the Crown Office, there was a report from Dr. Lipsage. You say Dr. Lipsage, in his expert witness report, provides a retrospective psychiatric diagnosis for Sheikh Bio. His review of the witness statements, toxicology reports and CCTV footage causes him to diagnose Sheikh Bio as having psychostimulant psychosis. This is consistent with my interpretation of the witness statements. Clinical toxicologists would generally use the term drug-induced psychosis, in this case referring to stimulant or sympathomimemic drug-induced psychosis, and you give the ICD-10 codes for both of those diagnoses. This is similar to the diagnosis of excited delirium that is used in the USA. The term excited delirium is not used in British clinical toxicological practice, being absent, for example, from ToxBase, the NPIS database used by clinicians from primary care, ambulance services and hospitals across the UK to guide management of poisoned patients. So I'd like to ask you some questions about that paragraph. We don't need to go back to your statement at this stage, but in paragraph 36 of your statement, you say that although you and Dr. Lipsage use different terminology, you don't think there's a difference in terms of what you're actually saying. You consider the diagnosis to be. So as a toxicologist, you prefer the term drug-induced psychosis, and I just wanted to be clear whether drug-induced psychosis is a diagnosis that you make as a clinical toxicologist.
So it's a working diagnosis we make. So, but I work very closely with liaison psychiatrists, who are psychiatrists who work in the general medical hospital and work with patients expressing mental health illness in the general hospital, rather than adult psychiatrists generally work in a separate psychiatry hospital. So we'd have a patient come in, I would make the diagnosis, I believe this is drug-induced psychosis, and then every patient I'd present to a psychiatrist, and we would then have a discussion. At the time, it's very difficult, as I said before, to make a clear diagnosis, because this may be the mental health illness in someone who takes drugs. So this would be the diagnosis I would proffer to a psychiatrist, who would then refine it and have the ultimate say. The psychiatrist would decide ultimately what it was.
And what led you to the conclusion, having reviewed the papers that you were provided by the Crown, that Shekobayo was suffering from drug-induced psychosis?
He displayed many of the features which were typical of the patients I would see in my ward in Edinburgh, in the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, of a psychosis, of a period of not being able to understand what's going on, of being not interacting with your environment, and the likelihood of being drug-induced as a result of the toxicology reports I'd read as well.
I'd like to take you again to a passage from Dr. Lipsage's evidence last week. He was asked to explain to the chair what psychostimulant intoxication is. And he said psychostimulants are drugs like amphetamine, like cocaine, like the group of drugs called cathinones, in which they have a sort of exciting, excitatory effect on the brain and the nervous system, and there is a release of dopamine, which is the pleasure-seeking component. There's also a release of adrenaline and noradrenaline, which can very commonly raise the heart rate, raise the blood pressure, and cause strain on the heart to make the heart vulnerable. And if a heart is deprived of oxygen, which can happen during restraint, then there's a risk of cardiac arrest due to disturbance of the rhythm of the heart. From your perspective as a toxicologist, would you agree with his description of psychostimulant intoxication or drug-induced psychosis?
I mean, there's a difference there between psychostimulant excitation. He says psychostimulant psychosis, and I agree drug-induced psychosis. He then said psychostimulant intoxication, which can involve heart. That's the whole panoply, not just the psychosis element. So there's a slight difference in terms, because he's talking about the whole effect of being on drugs, while we're talking here, the drug-induced psychosis is only one element of that panoply of effects you might see as a result of taking the drugs.
I see. Thank you. And can you offer a view as a toxicologist as to the likely primary cause of Mr. Bayo's drug-induced psychosis?
The literature suggests, for the blood concentration, of the two drugs he's taking, that alpha PVP is by far the more likely drug to cause psychosis. It's uncommon in MDMA. The most data I've seen is 4%. The case series we've seen of patients in Russia was 65%. So, on balance of probabilities, it was the alpha PVP that caused the psychosis.
And again, we don't need to go to your statement at this moment in time, but you offer the view in your statement in paragraph 101 that the psychosis on balance of probabilities would not have been due to the MDMA.
Yes.
Can you offer a view as to what part, if any, was played by the nandrolone?
If I look at what evidence I'd want to look at to try to understand the role, I'd want to know more about how the history of his taking. Was it a chronic use of nandrolone, or was it a short-term use? If it was chronic use, there's more likely to have been a problem resulting from it. But long-term use of nandrolone is more likely to have caused problems with the heart, which would have been visible at post-mortems, and nothing was seen at post-mortem. So since the heart wasn't obviously affected, the role of nandrolone is likely to be low, but it's not absent. If he's been taking it and it's caused problems with the heart, which has not yet caused changes which you can see by microscope, it may have had a role. I don't think there's a necessary need to say that nandrolone was involved in the psychosis.
Certainly, Dr. Lipsage, coming from his perspective as a psychiatrist, gave evidence that it was his view that the steroids were unlikely to have contributed significantly to Mr. Bayo's paranoid and violent behaviour, which was better accounted for by the alpha PVP.
Okay.
Would you agree with that statement?
I accept that, yes.
Returning to the screen and at the bottom of the page, we've looked at this already, you say that the diagnosis is similar to the diagnosis of excited delirium that is used in the USA. And you go on to explain that the term excited delirium is not used in British toxicological practice. Can you explain what you mean by that? It may be stating the obvious, but when you say it's not used in British toxicological practice, what should we understand?
So the diagnosis is not accepted as a relevant diagnosis for a patient who's presenting to hospital. So clinical toxicological practice is about the care of patients in a hospital. and I've never heard the word used in clinical practice. We don't think of terms. It seems to have developed out of the American post-mortem police restraint literature and really just hasn't penetrated, you might argue, into the UK literature. We use ICD-10, which has the terminology which is required to explain how Mr. Bayou was presenting.
And we've heard that excited delirium is not listed in ICD-10.
Absolutely.
Or for that matter in DSM-5.
Okay.
I'd like to ask you some questions about your experience of treating patients suffering from drug-induced psychosis. Where do you encounter such patients? Would it be on your ward rounds at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary?
So generally in the ward, and the ward round is a certain time of day where we go and see each individual patient, and sometimes that psychosis may be present in the patients we see on the ward round, but they may also be present during the day, and I'd go back to the ward to support the management of those patients. I also see that in the emergency departments, if I'm asked to go through and help, if a patient comes in who they believe is a drug-induced psychosis, we might be asked to go and support the emergency department clinicians managing the patient. Then I would stand back and be talking to the senior doctor there and just giving advice as the emergency doctors would be caring for the patient.
Typically, do you know what drugs the patient has taken?
Well, it depends what you mean by no. So I will be told this patient's taking cocaine, and there may be some history, but that person may have thought they were buying cocaine. What they truly bought is anyone's guess. So do I really know what each individual patient is affected by? No.
And if you did have that information, would that make a difference to your management of the patient?
Not particularly, but if we had really good information that this drug was more dangerous than this one, and this one caused this, then we could bear in mind what we'd expect to see. But that's really the only use we would have for it, to say, well, actually, this patient may get sick in 6 or 7 hours because we have data that's what happens with these patients. But fundamentally, the care we offer to the patients based on how they are in front of us. And so actually knowing what they've taken is actually not very important.
And we touched on this in passing before the break, but do I understand that you treat patients symptomatically because it would take several weeks if you were to take a sample of blood for analysis?
I mean, irrespective of what they've taken, they're presenting to the hospital with a problem, and that problem is something we can try to help them with. That problem might be agitation, might be psychosis, it might be a high temperature. So we try to assess those problems, whether they're present or not, and then we treat those particular problems irrespective of what they've taken.
And typically, do you know a patient's medical history?
Mostly yes. But I'm fortunate because by the time I see them in the ward, the medical records have been integrated together. When they first present to the emergency department, where my colleagues in the emergency department will generally see them first, 50-50. It would depend if they know the name, how much information they have. Because everything's electronic now, we can go back on and look at the medical record. There will be some people come in as unknown, and we've got no idea who they are until they recover, and then we find out who they are.
When you treat a patient who's presenting with psychosis, can you tell whether their psychosis has been caused by drugs or mental ill health, potentially a combination of the two?
So, again, it can use the word can I tell? So I would have hypotheses. A lot of medicine is about coming up with an idea which you test and try to understand whether you are right or not. So if someone comes in, they often have a label. This is drug-induced psychosis. And we might try to get a urine sample to go and test to what drugs in the urine, which gives us a very crude idea. It's not very specific for individual compounds. It might say they're taking cocaine or an opioid or an amphetamine. But we need a urine sample for that, which is quite difficult to get from an agitated patient, clearly. So there's a general presumption when people come in, there's a good chance it's a drug causing the psychosis. Many people with mental illness do use drugs. And so therefore, it's actually impossible to tell initially what's caused this psychosis. But there's often drugs involved. But the thing about drugs involved, it will go over several hours or days. So our general presumption is it's probably drug-induced psychosis, and we'll watch and see and support them and keep them safe during that time it takes for the drug to wear off. If after 3 days there's no effect at all, and perhaps by then we've managed to get a urine sample and there's nothing in the urine, then we say quite confidently at that point, this is probably not drug-induced psychosis, this is most likely to be mental health, a direct mental health illness. But they're very overlapped. People with mental illness treat themselves as well with drugs. So therefore, there's a big overlap.
Thank you. Can we go back to your statement, please, and to paragraph 52? Paragraph 52, you say, I've been asked whether I vary the approach I take dependent on the cause of the patient's psychosis. Not really. The reason they come and spend time with us is because they've often got mental health illness, but we're not sure whether drugs have caused this particular psychotic episode. We work very closely with psychiatry colleagues. In terms of changing a patient's medicines or getting them to take their usual prescribed oral medicines, they will help us to do that. That's particularly true for a patient with mental health illness who's known to have psychosis regularly and comes into the ward. But for someone who we're not quite sure what's going on and where we think it's probably drugs, we would do pretty much the same thing, so we may not be successful at getting oral medicines into them. So should we understand that the cause of a patient's psychosis doesn't really change your management of the patient? It's about treating them symptomatically.
Yes, that's true. Especially in the first time, in the acute situation.
Yes. Can we look at paragraph 72, please? You were asked about your experience of treating patients with alpha PVP and say you can't accurately answer. One of the issues with alpha PVP and many other recreational drugs from a treatment perspective is that we rarely have confirmation which drug the patient has taken. Confirmation can be achieved through taking a blood sample and testing for the presence of the drug. However, that is not available in a useful time frame to treat patients. I simply treat patients symptomatically. If the patient presents unwell and displays the symptoms of stimulant drug poison, I will treat them accordingly. So should we understand that although you've treated many patients suffering from the effects of stimulant drugs, it's simply impossible for you to say whether you've ever had a patient who has taken alpha PVP?
Seems unlikely, but I can't say for sure either way.
And at paragraph 73, you explain that testing for the presence of alpha PVP takes time. When you do your research, you take a blood sample to say this patient's been exposed to X, Y, or Z. In clinical practice, it would take 4 weeks for that to come back, and the patient is often either dead, alive, or home within 24 hours. We'd never get anything in a clinically relevant time frame, so we don't do it as part of clinical practice. We simply treat patients according to how they look in front of us. So if a patient comes in and he looks like he's taken a stimulant, or he looks like he's taken an opioid like heroin, we manage them according to the treatment pathways for those classes of drugs. They mostly get better once we look after them, but we don't know what precisely we're treating. If we were to take blood samples from all our patients and look at them over 2 to 3 years, we could see how things change over time. We can understand much better what's going on from a public health perspective. That tells us what is going on for future patients, but not for current patients. You mentioned there treatment pathways for different classes of drugs. What would be a treatment pathway for a stimulant like alpha PVP or MDMA?
So really very limited. We don't have a pure antidote. We don't have a drug. We don't have a treatment or an antidote which reverses the effect of the drug, which we have for heroin with naloxone. So for stimulants, we can only try and treat them symptomatically. And those, again, is trying to get agitation under control. So we use benzodiazepines. The drugs are a little bit like alcohol, which calm the brain down. We would look for their temperature and independently try and bring their temperature down. And if they were psychotic, we would initially use benzodiazepines, but we'd also potentially use antipsychotic medicines and with discussion with our psychiatric colleagues.
Can I ask you how a person suffering from stimulant drug-induced psychosis would present? How would you expect to see them?
They'd often be brought in by the police or by their family, so they wouldn't themselves bring themselves to hospital. They might come in a private car, they might come by ambulance. They may therefore receive some medicines at the site from the paramedics, but if they've come in with their family or with friends, they're not going to receive anything. They'll arrive at the hospital and generally be very agitated, be unsure what's going on, sometimes aggressive if they don't truly understand people are trying to help them. Their heart rate will typically be fast. They may come into the hospital and require restraint. So we have a busy department, there's lots of people there. If someone comes in who's very paranoid and very aggressive, there's a potential for violence to occur, which will influence staff, the patient themselves, and also users of the emergency department. So there's a lot of variability, but agitation is commonly there. And we'll see that because you can see that as they come in, they're agitated, or they may be psychotic and just completely confused. Then we would try and, they'd be seen very rapidly in the emergency department, and then we might try to take observations, look at their blood pressure, look at their pulse, try to get an understanding of their temperature. But often that's not possible until they've got restraint and the patient's been calmed down.
That brings us nicely to a discussion about how you manage these patients on the ward. So when you are presented with a patient who is, as you've described, perhaps confused, almost certainly agitated, maybe psychotic, how would you approach that person? What would be your first line, as it were, in terms of treatment and management of that patient?
So the first line is to assess the situation. Mm-hmm. What level of danger is available? How violent is this person? I mean, an 82-year-old woman with psychosis offers a very different situation to a 30-year-old man with psychosis, just in terms of physicality. And both of those occur, and they both need very careful care, but there's a certain difference. If the situation is not dangerous, if it appears that we can talk to the person, the first thing we do is start talking. You talk and try to persuade them, to tell them where they are, try to reorientate them to what's happening, that they're in a safe place. This is something we would try to look after them. That's the key thing, is try to create communication with them, because the level of agitation will determine how much they can understand. Clearly, if they're truly psychotic, they'll probably understand nothing. But if they're less severely affected, then something will come through. And if they can gradually realize they're in a safe place, there's no aggression going on, that people are calmly talking to them, there's a chance they'll calm down. And at that point, we might talk to them and simply try to find what's going on. Will they tell us they've taken a stimulant, or are we relying on what other people have told us? I would typically use benzodiazepines as a first choice, so diazepam. I'd take 20 milligrams in my hand and go and sit down and talk with them and try to persuade them to take them. And that's about just saying this will make you feel better. This is what it is. Try to get through to a point where they're understanding. If they can understand, they'll often take the medicine, and then they'll feel a lot better. There's other medicines we can use, but that's the first one we would typically use. If it's unsafe, if there's aggression going on, that we feel that people are in danger, we would call the security and the police within the hospital and use physical restraint. The problem with physical restraint is it's basically a dangerous thing to do and something you try and keep as short as possible. So if that was required because of the situation, we would then immediately start drawing up drugs to give either intramuscularly or via cannula to try to get on top of the situation. Because the general feeling is the shorter the amount of time that someone is restrained, the better the situation. That doesn't mean short restraint is always safe, but it's safer than 1 hour restraint. And if someone's got a lot of drugs on board, and if we don't give them medicines, you will have to physically restrain them for a long time. So in the hospital, you assess the situation, and if we can't use talk to try to de-escalate the situation, we'll very rapidly call in physical restraint, but someone's drawing up medicines to get on top of them. Now, the medicine can take a little bit of time to work. So the point maybe is, well, if I give 20 milligrams of diazepam, how long is it going to take to work? It's partly about how long will it take to work fully, and how long will it take to have any effect. And a drug going in might have any effect within a couple of minutes. It may not be fully having its effect until 5, 10, or 15, but it might begin to de-escalate the situation and make the person fight less against the restraint that's going on, which they can't understand at all.
Thank you. So you say you begin by assessing the situation, effectively carrying out a risk assessment, looking at the level of danger that the person is presenting.
Yes.
Would that be to themselves as well as to other people on the ward?
Yep.
And if it's safe to do so, then you will begin by talking to the
Yes.
person. Can we look at paragraph 42 of your statement, please? You've spoken about the importance of communication and of telling the person that they're safe and keeping the conversation going. If we can scroll a little bit further down that paragraph, please. You describe the presentation of patients on your ward and say what I would do with those patients is to try to get them to understand the situation. Sometimes they have some understanding. I would use the words they're familiar with and work in an empathic way where I'm not aggressive towards them and calm. I'm telling them they'll feel better with these medicines. They'll sometimes take the medicines and you can see them just relax. Over the next 5 minutes, their body just changes and they'll sit in a chair and become less confused. So you talk about using familiar language, empathy, and remaining calm and talking to the patient. Can we look at paragraph 46? You've been describing a process which I think may be known as de-escalation. Would that be an appropriate label?
Yes.
And you were asked here to describe the verbal de-escalation techniques that you would use when dealing with a psychotic patient. And you say, I would use a quiet voice, but one they can hear, speak in a normal voice. You would ordinarily never yell at a patient. However, we do sometimes yell when things are going out of control and we're trying to shock them into not doing what they're doing. But generally, we try and speak as calmly as we can. We try to always tell them what's going on. We tell them where they are and try to reorientate them. We try to encourage them, telling them that the medicines we're offering would be good for them. We're not getting informed consent for giving them medicines because they do not understand what's going on. I just want the medicines into them because I know it will calm them down. So, just a calm voice, keep talking, use language they understand, don't use big words. So the same themes arise in this paragraph as in the one that we looked at a moment ago. Calm voice, keep the conversation going, and use simple language. At paragraph 47, you were asked to describe your body language when you're dealing with a patient who is psychotic. And you describe your body language as warm and empathic. You're aiming not to look aggressive. Sometimes I've seen in hospitals the security guards can be quite aggressive and get in a boxing position when these things are happening, which really doesn't help at all. Actually, I've sometimes asked security guards to leave because they're making the situation worse. So in your statement, you speak about the importance of your tone of voice, the language that you use, the information that you convey, and also your body language in terms of trying to de-escalate a situation. And if we can perhaps look at paragraph 51, where you're asked about things that don't work so well with psychotic patients, and you say being aggressive, making the patient frightened, doing anything to stimulate their fight or flight response is not going to help. So you would always find in the hospital that people who are dealing with these patients are trying to be as calm as possible. It's wonderful to watch the nurses with these patients. They're really calm. They just try to settle things down. They're always talking in a nice voice, trying to get the situation under control, while at the same time, someone will be phoning for security and for a doctor in case it doesn't work. So you've given examples in your statement about how you practice de-escalation on a ward, in terms of the language you use, the approach you take, your body language, tone of voice. And you've also given examples of things that will only serve to aggravate the situation. And you say anything that will stimulate the fight or flight response is not going to help. Again, I'd like to take you to the evidence that we heard last week from Dr. Lipsitch and invite your comment. Dr. Lipsitch told us that what he teaches medical students is in a situation like that, you have to pretend you've got unlimited time. Of course, you haven't got unlimited time, but you have to give the patient the impression that you're able to listen to them and that you're not in a hurry. Now, of course, for professional reasons, you might well be in a hurry, but you have to convey the feeling that you have unlimited time to spend in discussion with the patient. Is that a statement that you would agree with or disagree with?
Yes, I think people need time and need calmness, and rushing is not a good thing.
Earlier in your evidence, before we return to your statement, you told us about the approach that you might require to take, either when de-escalation has not been successful, or I might perhaps reasonably assume if your initial risk assessment tells you that it's just not a safe option. Before we look at that in more detail, is it often the case that you have to move directly to restraint and administration of medicines, or more frequently than not, are you at least able to attempt de-escalation first?
So in my clinical practice, I'm generally seeing them after they left the emergency department and they're already in a ward. Mm-hmm. And in such a situation, I would always use de-escalation. I can't remember any times where I've gone straight to restraint. But in the emergency department, when they're coming in from the street and they're first coming into this constrained environment, potentially with the police, sometimes not, there will be times where it goes straight to restraint.
And what would the reason for that be?
The level of danger. You've got an emergency department full of people. You've got a patient potentially risk harming themselves and harming healthcare workers looking after them. So if there's a feeling of urgent potential danger to anybody, the patient or the people around them, then they'll move more forward with that. By the time they've come through to us, they've generally had some medicines. So it's not quite such an acute situation of what I generally deal with.
Do you have experience of dealing with the more acute situations?
So yes, that's where I come to the emergency department, I get called down and say, please come and help us, we have a patient, but I'm not generally the one leading those arrests. They have, not arrest, the dealing with the situation is dealt with by the emergency department, but I stand with the consultant and we talk.
If we could perhaps go to paragraph 55 of your statement, which again is a reference back to your report, and you say that sometimes the agitation is too great for this approach, that's the de-escalation approach, to work, and the person cannot understand the situation or calm down. In this case, the person must be physically restrained to allow rapid and safe administration of intravenous or intramuscular sedative drugs such as diazepam or ketamine. Duration of physical restraint is kept to an absolute minimum to reduce the risk of complications. As soon as the patient is sufficiently sedated with medicines, physical restraint is withdrawn. Could you perhaps describe the process of restraint as carried out in an emergency department, one that you've perhaps witnessed when you've been talking to the consultant?
So there are security people available in the hospital. There are police. There's a small police station at the back of the emergency department in the hospital. So a situation's agreed that it's urgent restraint is required, a phone call will go out to security to ask for people to come, and generally 6 people would be a normal number to actually try to get on top of things, because you don't want too few people. You want to make sure you can physically hold limbs and stop them kicking out, and have enough people there to hold the person down in a safe position while the medicines are being administered.
You said earlier in your evidence, when we were looking at the addendum to your report, I'm not an expert in use of force. I'm a clinician who has to, at times, use force to safely care for a patient.
Yeah.
So the purpose of using force, should we understand that purpose to be as a means to an end, and that end is to provide care to the patient?
Absolutely. And also to hold them, and they may be harming themselves at the time. Getting hold of arms and limbs can keep them safe from whatever they're doing. And so not only is it a means to an end to get chemical restraint, and we talk about physical restraint and chemical restraint. Physical is the physical holding hands, chemical is using medicines. So we use physical to get to the chemical, but actually the pure act of physical as well making them safe.
I'd like to talk to you about 2 hypothetical situations. We've heard evidence at an earlier stage in the inquiry from experts in the use of force and police tactics and restraint. And 2 scenarios were discussed that both involved engagement by the police. The first scenario was described as de-escalation, and that was described to us as a scenario where the officers would engage and negotiate and de-escalate, try to understand what was going on, to allow them to inform the decision-making about the process. It was an opportunity to communicate. It was key to building rapport, and they would attempt to de-escalate, engage and negotiate. So we'll call that the de-escalation scenario. Mm-hmm. And another scenario that we heard about in evidence was what was referred to colloquially as a hard stop, mm-hmm. or otherwise a verbal dominance approach. And it was described as an authoritarian approach, wanting to try and control the individual, a verbal dominance approach of communication, a methodology of trying to dominate the individual by getting them to comply with the instructions to minimise the risk or minimise the requirement to possibly use other force. So we were calling that the verbal dominance approach, or the hard stop. And I wonder, from your perspective as a clinical toxicologist, and given your experience of managing and treating patients suffering from drug-induced psychosis on wards, whether you might help the chair to understand the difference that each approach might lead to in terms of dealing with someone who is intoxicated and suffering from agitation and psychosis.
In a way, you could say they are the two options in a way. That our risk assessment says, can we go in with de-escalation? And that works in many cases. I can't give you a number, but that is an approach which clearly works and allows you to get medicines into these very agitated people and calm the situation quite quickly. The second thing you're describing is not that dissimilar to a situation where someone's come in and the risk assessment says, this is too dangerous, cannot allow this to continue what he or she is up to, and we need to get on top of the situation. That might be the situation where you would yell, but I think the big difference between the situation, Mr. Bayo's situation, and what we have, is we are at home in a way. We know our setup, we know our individuals, we're working as a team, and we're not arriving somewhere. The person's coming to us. So our hard stop is different to where we might not yell at all to the patient. We might simply go, we need drugs now, we need security now, we've got 3 minutes, 4 minutes to get on top of the situation. And so the security cards will be there, and they will go straight in and get on top of the situation. We will go straight in and give medicines. So if you are describing if our routine approach was to do the hard stop approach, that would inflame the situations that wouldn't be required in many of the cases. But again, we're very trained in the hospital. We know what we're doing in the situations. They're common. We build up skills. So we're working from a situation where the hard stops would be done differently because the restraint is purely to get on top and then get drugs in, which is not available in the community at the moment.
Thank you. Can you bear with me just a moment, please? Thank you, Professor Eddleston. I don't have any further questions for you. Thank you.
Okay.
Are there any Rule 9 applications? Just the one. Professor Eddleston, I wonder if you would withdraw to the witness room while I hear a submission. Yes, Dean of Faculty.
My Lords, I'm obliged. It's very brief. In the course of the examination of the witness, he was taken to his original report, and at pages 27 to 28 of the transcript, the Learned Counsel looked at paragraphs 17 and 18 in the original report, and then at line 5 on page 28, said in the paragraphs that follow, you set out how patients with acute psychosis are managed in emergency departments. You offer a view as to how Sheikh Obayo might have been handled differently by the police, and you conclude in paragraph 24 by recommending a discussion between police and emergency medicine physicians to increase understanding of how to manage these patients and to refine the current guidance. Answer, yes. Would that be a fair summary of the addendum to your report? Answer, yes. My Lord, the short point I would like to explore is that in that summary, and indeed in the witness statement, there's been no consideration of paragraph 23 of the original report, which might contain material of assistance to the chair in the ultimate determination. And I would welcome 5 minutes, and I don't think it will take more than that, to explore paragraph 23 and the first sentence of paragraph 24 of the original report with him.
Could we get the report up on the screen, please, in these paragraphs?
I think it's there, so if we just keep scrolling. Yes, it's 23 in the first sentence of paragraph 24, my Lord.
Just let me read that.
Indeed.
Yes, very well. I shall allow you to explore that with the witness.
Please, Lord.
Professor Eddleston, Mr. Dunlop, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Advocates, represents certain of police officers who attended, and he has some questions for you.
Professor, just very briefly, please, you'll see on the screen we have, I think, the report from 2017 to which you were taken earlier.
Yep.
I'd just like to explore briefly the content of what's, or some of what's on the screen. In paragraph 23, you say, overall the situation on that morning was difficult and fast-moving. A powerfully built psychotic man had been violent to people and cars. He did not respond to clear police instructions. And is that consistent with what you'd been told regarding this matter?
Yes.
You go on to say, unfortunately, his psychosis prevented him from understanding the situation or the instructions. His paranoid thoughts caused him to attack the police, resulting in physical restraint until submission, without the aid of medicines to induce sedation, administered by paramedical or medical staff. If we just pause there, I wonder if you can just help us with a couple of aspects of this. Firstly, the psychosis preventing him from understanding the situation. Can you help His Lordship with what's going on in the mind, and what is it, the process that prevents the person undergoing the psychosis from really comprehending the actuality of what's in front of him?
I'm not an expert on this, so Professor Dr. Lipsedge would have been a person better able to describe what's really going on inside the head. What I see from my clinical interaction with these patients is a puzzlement, overstimulation of the brain, and a lack of understanding of anything that's going on with them once they get to a certain level. Clearly, by my de-escalation, I'm trying to either bring them down to a level where they understand. It wasn't attempted with him, so I'm not quite sure whether it would have worked, but he didn't seem to understand what was going on.
Okay, thank you. And the second aspect of that, you say his paranoid thoughts caused them to attack the police. Now, I mean, again, would your answer be the same there, that that's really for Mr. Liversidge to look at, or are you able to help us with your reasoning in that regard?
We know that paranoia is part of psychosis, and paranoia is a certain interpretation of the world around them, which involves danger to the person, and the person's responding to that. I think what I was trying to do here was explain why I'd come off subject of what I wasn't asked to answer on, to try to explain the situation as I saw it. But I wasn't as an expert, which I did say at the beginning.
Yeah. I'm interested then, just before we close, in the last sentence at paragraph 23, you say at the point physical restraint was started, his prognosis was poor.
Yes.
And again, if you could just assist the chair in that regard, please.
We know that the longer the physical restraint goes on, and if someone's violently fighting back against physical restraint, that puts them at risk of hypoxia, of low levels of oxygen in the blood, which will increase the risk of cardiac dysrhythmias, something called ventricular fibrillation occurring. In that case, unless that happens in a hospital, that's a very dangerous thing, will likely result in death. CPR can be started by bystanders, which can sometimes be effective. But I think the fact that the physical restraint was started without the drugs being drawn up, without a plan in place to actually administer those drugs, then his prognosis was poor.
And you say that at the point the restraint was started, the prognosis is poor. So looked at the moment the restraint starts, what is it that makes the prognosis poor at that point in time?
Because he's not understanding what's going on. He's fighting against the restraint. And that restraint, that is going to go on until he's exhausted. and that puts him at risk of not being able to breathe properly and his heart not properly and would die from it. If that restraint had been started and there had been a plan, an availability of a paramedic or a doctor able to provide drugs within a few minutes, then the prognosis would have been different. It would have been better. I'm not sure how good it would have been. But I think almost as soon as you get medicines into a patient, there is a beginning of the process of chemical de-escalation. But by going ahead and doing this without that plan in place, the prognosis was very poor.
And of course, whether or not that planning is able to be in place will depend upon the particular circumstances.
And also the systems in place within the healthcare systems, can we do that? For sure.
And finally, Professor, at 24 you say psychosis is a well-recognised complication of stimulant drug use with a poor prognosis when public safety requires physical restraint without medical support. And is that really just a follow-on from what you've just told us?
Yes. Medical support is about having a clinician around, could be a paramedic or a doctor or a nurse, who's able to give medicines which will calm the situation down.
So that's the ideal. But
That's the idea, and it does happen sometimes. So, for example, in Edinburgh, there's a vehicle that's sitting outside the hospital which gets called out to various situations. In generally, that's for trauma. So a car crash, they will go out and they'll be there to supply them. Occasionally in the past, it has been used to go and deal with patients like this and provide drugs. I've talked to emergency medicine consultants who have been in the community to provide these drugs. But there's no process in place, there's no systems in place. I'm not sure it's funded to do that. So it's not the standard approach, but it would, if it was possible in our health system to provide that care at the site of these interactions, it would make things safer. I don't know how safe, but it would make it safer.
do I apprehend from what you've just said that while that might be an ideal, in truth it rarely happens for various reasons that we can doubtless imagine?
I believe so. I don't know. I don't, from the perspective of an emergency medicine consultant or registrar going out, I don't think it happens very often. But ambulance paramedics, some of them have the skills to be able to do some way along that pathway. They can give diazepam intramuscularly. I don't know the protocols precisely within the ambulance services. So there's some partial way towards that. It's not an ideal situation at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. I'm obliged, Lord.
Professor Eddleston, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. I'm grateful to you for the time you've given me.
Thank you.
I'm about to adjourn and then you'll be free to go.
Thanks.